So this is not the time for a membership drive. That's what you're saying.
Baruch Hashem, the Aguda always loves to welcome new members. The Aguda was built with future members in mind. Baruch Hashem.
Yeah.
Today's broadcast is sponsored by David Zolti, the Onishmas of Moshe Ben Chaim, whose first church out is Yud Kislev, which is Thursday, the Shabbat Shadav Aliyah, and he should be a male Yosher for all of us stuck here on planet Earth.
Yeah.
Today's also the Yortzeit of the Boston Rebbe, the first Boston Rebbe who lived in Boston. It's his Yortzeit today, which is an interesting Yortzeit. It's also a Lubavitch Yortzeit today. Rab Nochem Doiv Schneerson. He was not in the line to become Rebbe, but he was one of the Rebbe Shekidalach. It's also the Kamarna Rebbe, Rav Mordechai Kamarna. It's his Yortzeit, and it's also the Yortzeit of someone who probably the Olam doesn't know. Yid by the name of Laser Geldzeiler. Did anyone hear of the name of Laser Geldzeiler? He was a Geldzeiler. He had a good name. His name was Laser Geldzeiler. When I was in Lakewood, he actually read me my first shidduch. He read me my first shidduch that I went out with that didn't work, and my wife was my second shidduch. So this was Laser Geldzeiler. He died at 46. He was very young in a car crash in Eretz Yisrael. But he was a very chashuv man. He was aided by the Tversky in Milwaukee, and he's an anical. He has lit the shichas, but he wore struckers. So he was a very tall guy. He had a long black beard with long pays. He wore a beebetel and he wore velvet, so he looked like a rebbe. So I remember him walking into, but he was a regular guy in yeshiva. He was just a regular guy. So I remember when he used to walk into rooms, people would stand up for him because he had such an impressive image to him because of his beard and his struckers. I think it was even the Rashiva stood up for him, who didn't know who he was. But he was a very, very tired chashavit. He had a small yeshiva, and he died in a car crash. There were write-ups about him when he died in the magazines.
Sounds like the definition of Stoltz.
The write-up in the magazine actually shows what a caring person he was. There was someone who could be with him. His children was driving there at a gas station, and they had a picture of him, and he had a distinct look. So the guy at the gas station said, "Who's this? Who's this picture of?" Because the guy had an experience with him where he helped him. It was an interesting type of story. But you see, he was very caring to every individual. Okay, so let's see the head of the Gemara weiter. We started this yesterday, but we'll review it again quickly. The halacha is that if a woman gives birth to a nekeva, she's tomei for 2 weeks, no matter what, even if she's naki. And for the next 33 days, for the next 66 days, any dam that she sees is dam tayar, she will not be tummy. That's midaraisa. Of course, nowadays we don't fish like that. But midaraisa, any dam that she sees for the next 66 days, she'll be tar. And then at the end of the entire 80-day sequence of the 14 days of Yemei Tomei and the 66 days of Yemei Tayar, she brings a carbon on day 81, and then she's mutter to eat karbanos again. So the shaila is, what happens if she conceives during the Yemei Tayar? So she had relations after the Yemei Tomei, and she gave birth not to a live child, of course, but she had a miscarriage within those 80 days. The halacha is that even though it's another birth, nevertheless, at the end of the 80 days, she just has to bring one carbon, and it'll cover her for anything that happened in this period of time. Of course, if she had a miscarriage on the 81st day, she's out of bounds. Now she has to bring a new one, a new carbon. What happens if she gives birth or l'shmoinim, the night after the 80th day, before the 81st day? Now, this whole shaila here is going to be a shaila about this carbon, but the raya will be very simple. It says or l'shmoinim v'achas, so we know or is lila. That's really the whole purpose of this whole Gemara, is just to prove that or is lila, which has nothing to do with the details of this shaila. But nevertheless, so if she had a miscarriage the night after the 80th day, so So the halacha is Beishamai poitri mikarbon. Beishamai holds even though she's not in her Yomei Tayar anymore, but since she didn't bring her carbon yet till the next morning, because you can't bring carbons at night, it'll patter up that chi of carbon that was triggered for the second birth, for the second miscarriage. Basil holds no. Once the miscarriage happened after the 80-day period, it doesn't make a difference if she brought her carbon for it yet or not. The fact is that it's not included in that 80 days. She has to bring a separate carbon. Amar lahen Basil Beishamai. Basil asked Beishamai, "My shna or shmoina vechad miyom shmoina vechad. What is the difference between the night of the 80th, the night of the 81st day, and the day of the 81st day? At the end of the day, by Jews, the day ends in the evening, and now it's a new day, and she should have to bring a separate carbon." That was the first argument that Basil made. The second argument he made is Shiva lo toma lo yishva lo carbon. We know if she saw dam during the 80 days, she's not tummy. She doesn't have to count 7 days because it's in the Yomei Tayar. But if she saw dam the night after the 80th day, at this very time where she had birth, she would be tummy. So you see, she's already out of the 80-day period of the Yomei Tayar. Once she's out of that period, why don't you say that she should be chayav a carbon if she had a miscarriage then? Zok the Gemara, mitgamer Beishil Beishamai, Maishna or Shmoinen ve'echad, v'yom Shmoinen ve'echad. The way Beis Hillel expressed himself was juxtaposing or to Yom Shemamina or to Shemamina. You see that Beis Hillel and the Tanoim in their speech, when they said the word or, they meant night. Another proof that we make big comments by night. Now we're discussing the halachas of the carbon shlomim and how much time you have to eat it once you shecht it. So yachol yehei nechel or the shlishi. Now we know that the shlomim you can eat it the day of the shchita, the night after the shchita, and the next day. And at the end of the day, there's a cutoff. You can no longer eat the carbon shlomim, and it becomes noisar. But you don't burn noisar at night. The Torah tells us you burn noisar the next morning, which would be the third day in the morning. A carbon taida can only be eaten for 1 day. And the shlomim can be eaten for 2 days. Just like by the taida, the night that's given to you is the night after the day. So the day of the shechita, you're allowed to eat it, and you're allowed to eat it the entire night after the shechita until the next morning. So it's logical to argue, afkan by the shlomim, laila acher hayoim. You should be able to eat it not only to the end of the second day, but the night after the second day until the third day in the morning, you should be able to eat the carbon shlom. Talmud loymar, v'yoim zivchachem ye'achel umimachras. So let's look at the pasuk inside. It says in the pasuk, "V'yom zevchachem yeyachel." The shlomim is eaten on the day that it's shechted, umi machras, and the day after it's shechted. V'anoiser ad yom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. But the Gemara darshans v'anoiser ad yom, and the Gemara darshans ba'od yom hunechal. It can only be eaten on the second day while it's still day. Ve'ein nechal la'or shlishi, but it can't be eaten the evening of the third day. So the raya again is going to be that Oris Laila is because it says La'or Shlishi. But now we're in the middle of the Sugya of Shlomim. So the question is, can the Shlom be eaten the night after the second day? The answer is no, because we learn it from the Pasuk V'anoisher Adjoim. Now really a carbon taida, which is what we're comparing the Shlomim to, is really a Shlomim. It's like a modified Shlomim. So the question is, if we give 2 days, if the Torah gives 2 days for a carbon Shlomim, why didn't the Torah give 2 days for a carbon taida? So Rabbi Elevin spoke out a very interesting thing. What is the purpose of a carbon taida? It's to give thanks to the Rebbeinu Shalom. When you give thanks to the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Rebbeinu Shalom wants it to be a public affair. So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, bring a carbon, bring with it 40 breads. There's no way you can eat that all by yourself in 1 day. So the Torah limits the amount of time that you have to eat it so that you have so much to eat in such a short period of time. The only option you have is to invite a lot of guests. And if you invite a lot of guests, then you'll be able to eat up the entire carbon toida, and all of the lechem, all of the breads that come with them. So therefore, your carbon toida is going to be a public thanks to the Rebbeinu Shalom for whatever you brought your carbon toida for. So Zok the Gemara, if after the day 2, at the end of day 2, in the evening, you're no longer allowed to eat the shlomen, and it becomes nicer, so Yachal Yisarf Miyad. I would think that I burned this nicer right away on the night after the shlomen becomes nicer. V'dinu, and the svara should dictate that. Zvachim nechalu v'yoyim v'layla, l'yoyim v'layla echad. A carbon toida is eaten for a day and a night afterwards. U'shlomen nechalum l'shnei yom v'layla echad. And the shlomen is eaten for 2 days and 1 night. Mal halon, just like by the carbon toida, takef lachila shreifa, right after the time that you're allowed to eat it, meaning when it becomes nicer, you can immediately burn it. Afkan, so too by the shlamim, let's argue that takef lachila shreifa. The moment you can no longer eat the shlamim, which is at the end of the 2nd day, in the night, you should be able to burn the nicer right away. So tomorrow, Talmud Loimar, the noisar mipsar hazevach, B'yoyim hashlishi ba'esh yisarv. And we learn from there that b'yoyim atasarv, you only burn nicer by day. And I believe the pasuk that we just quoted is by Carbon Pesach. We only burn nicer by day. V'i atasarv b'layla. You never burn nicer by night. And that's why even though the shlomo becomes nicer as the night approaches, as the night arrives, nevertheless, you won't be able to burn it till the next morning. Zok the Gemara. When the Brisa suggests that there should be a havamina, that you should be able to shlomen the evening before the 3rd day, alma or urtahu, you see that the definition of our is night, shmamina. Zok the Gemara, nacharayim, tashma, or shal yoyim HaKippurim, the evening of Yom HaKippurim. Again, the raya is going to be obvious that or is laila, but the evening of Yom HaKippurim, mispal sheva. There are 7 brachas in the Shmoneh Esrei. The first 3, the last 3, and the one in the center. Umisvada, and you say vidu after Shmoneh Esrei like we do. Shachris is the same thing. Mishpal Sheva Umisvada. The Musaf Mispal Sheva Umisvada. The Mincha Mispal Sheva Umisvada. The Arvis, but Motzah Yom Kippur Mispal Me'ein Shmoneh Esrei. You daven a shortened version, even though officially that's not the minig. But unofficially, I think that's the minig in every shul, where they daven Meir of Motzei Shabbos. It's a me'en Shmoneh Esrei. It's me'en atfilah, because everyone is in a rush, because everyone's hungry to go home. Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel Omer Mishum Avoisov Mispal Shmoneh Esrei Shleimus. You say a proper full Shmoneh Esrei, which is really what we do. If not for the fact that we had to say Ata Chaynan Tanu, we'd be able to have a shorter Shmoneh Esrei. But whatever the case is, alma or urtu, you see clearly from this brisa that or means evening because it's talking about the first Shmoneh Esrei of Yom Kippur. Shmamina. Toshma. The Talmud of Shmuel. Shmuel said, Leile arba osar boikin es achavi. So look at this. Shmuel didn't use the word or. He used the word laila. And he said, Leile arba osar boikin es achavi la'ar hader. Alma or urtahu, you see clearly from the fact that Shmuel explicitly used the word Laila rather than use the word or, it shows that or of our Mishnah means nighttime. Zok Gemara, Elabein Rav Huna, Ubein Rav Yehuda, the Chula Alma or urtahu. So we've pretty much proven unequivocally that or means night. But didn't we have a Madamar who said or is nagi, it means light? How will he deal with all of our overwhelming rayas that or means laila? But likely it's not really a machlokes. Everybody agrees that or does mean nighttime. Marki asrei, umarki asrei. Just each one of the 2 Amoraim expressed it in the way that his city would express the word night. But Asher Rav Huna, Kari Nagi. In the city of Rav Huna, they use the word light to describe night. Like a saginor, Rashi says, like they use the word light to describe the word night, not because it rhymes, because in Aramaic it probably didn't rhyme, but because just like people say on a blind person you can see, it's a saginor, so they used, that's how they expressed night. Kari Leili. And in the home, in the city of Rabbi Yehuda, they described night with the word night. Laila. Frank the Gemara, V'tani Didam. Now that you see Shmuel had no problem quoting a brisa that says Laila, my time of Katani Leili. Why doesn't our time say night? The Gemara Lishnam Al Yehuda. It's a nicer way of speaking. And what Lishnam Al we're soon going to bring rise how a person has to be careful with the speech to speak in a very clean way. But here, night is not a bad word. So what's the problem with night? So Rashi tells us, we just get a better focus on it. Lav mishum delele davar megunahu. There's nothing inappropriate about the word night. Rabbi Shua ben Levi ba'alma itmar. Rabbi Shua ben Levi is referring in general, and we'll see what he says shortly about speaking in a very clean language. What we gather from what he said is that lashon chachamim lechazer acher lashon tzach v'nochi. We're looking for a precise, good language. There's a whole bunch of different pshatim here, but based on what we spoke about earlier from the Ravid, that or indicates the beginning of the night. Laila means the whole night. So although they're both correct terms to describe the night, the Tana always wants us to pick the most precise language to express what it wants to. And in this case, we're trying to focus on the beginning of the night, and that's why the Tana wanted to use the word or. And even though there was some ambivalence, it wasn't perfectly clear what it meant, but once we have it proven what it meant, it's a much more accurate way of describing the beginning of the night. Zok the Gemara.
Yosy, who's the one who said that or means the beginning of the night?
The Ravid. Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rabbi Shua ben Levi. La'olam al yoytzi adam davar megudim mipiv. A person should never allow something not nice to come out of his mouth. This sugi is going to be a little bit difficult for me to learn because the focus of the Gemara is measuring your words and not speaking one extra word out of your mouth. So I'm going to try very hard to conform. It's very not my style. Sharei to Gemara. I'm going to show you an example of the Torah using an extra 8 letters, but avoided using a word that's not as nice. Shenemar, when it talks about the behemoths that Noach had to admit into the teva, it said min habehema haTorah, min habehema asher einenu Torah. Instead of saying asher einenu Torah, it could have said Tameya. And the difference, if you do the count between the word Tameya and asher einenu Torah, would be 8 letters. Rav Papa Omer Teisha. Rav Papa said, I have another example of where the Torah.
There are other cases where it does use the word coming, right? So why they're not in other places?
I couldn't hear what you said.
All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you.
Saying, aren't there lots of other places, actually in the same parsha, that does use the word tamei?
Beautiful kasha, beautiful kasha. The Gemara on Number Beis is going to deal with that. You found me one example. I know people who use 4-letter words every day, and once in a while they don't. Right? No, I'm not using any names here. So the question is, what does it mean? So we'll see on Number Beis.
Parsha Shmini is full of the word tamei. It's like a
The Tamei Yikra, right?
yeah.
Yeah, but even specifically with Noach, there's another place.
That's right. It's a very good art. The Gemara deals with it. The Gemara deals with it on Number Beis. So Zok the Gemara. I have an example of where the Torah used 9 extra letters. Shenemar ki yibecha ish asher lo yiatar mikra loyla. It could have said ki yibecha ish asher yitameh. So if you do the tally, you'll see there's an extra 9 letters here. Avinamar Eser, 10 letters. Why? Because Vav the Tahar. When you count the Shaloyah Tahar, if you count it without the Vav, then it's 9 letters. If you count the Vav, you'll find, in fact, that there's 10 extra letters. I have an example of a pasuk where there was an extra 16 letters to avoid using the word Tuma. Shenemar, and I believe this is by the Haftarah of Mocher Chodesh, where David HaMelech did not show up to the Suda, and Yonason was trying to make excuses for why David wasn't there, and that's the story where David where Shaul threw a spear at Yonason, who was very upset, and then Yonason had the story with the arrows to signal to David that he needs to run away. So it says, he Omar, the first day that David was missing, he didn't question it, because he said, Mikrahu built a tarhu kiloi tar. So you see there's a whole long expression rather than just say tamahu, and that works out to 16 extra oisirs. Tanya devei Rabbi Shmuel, la'olam yisaper adam b'loshen nekiya. A person should always speak with a clean lashon. Sharei bezov karai merkav. Now there's a tumah that if a zov sits on something, the zov is metamit. He makes it into an avatuma. And it doesn't make a difference if you're sitting on a horse or sitting on a chair. It's the same tumah. And when the Torah discusses the tumah that a zov conveys when he sits on something, the Torah used the word merkav, riding on a horse. When you're riding on a horse, your legs are split open. So by women don't ride on horses because it's not theistic. If anything, they'll ride side saddle. And therefore, uve isha, when the Torah wanted to express this tumah by a zova, kari moishav. Again, because it reflects the woman's, when the woman sits in the more of its theistic fashion, and that's how the Torah describes it. The Omer, it says, so Rabbi Shmuel brings one raya that you're supposed to speak b'lashon nekiya, because when the Torah expressed the tumas merkav by a woman, the Torah used the word moishav. That's raya number one. Raya number two, it says v'tivchar lashon arumim. You have to pick a clever lashon. The Omer, there's a third pasuk to prove the same point. The das safasai bar milaloi. My lips are going to have very clear words. So, frankly, my why so many rayas to the same point? Whenever you want to argue that when the Torah uses the word moishav for azava rather than merkav, so I would say hanimili b'daraisa. The Torah speaks in a very, very careful fashion. Abul b'drabanan, when the Rabbanan are paskening something, maybe they're allowed to say the word tumah. Maybe they're allowed to use different types of words. Or the one like Tashma, referring to Rabbanim who have to be very careful in their manner of speech. You might argue, okay, the Rabbanan in a formal conversation have to be careful, but in standard speech, maybe you don't have to be so careful. So in all events, wherever you are, you have to be careful the way you speak. You know, by the Goyim, there's something called a hot mic moment. By Yidden, there shouldn't ever be something called a hot mic moment, because even when we're not speaking in front of an audience, all the time, our speech is supposed to be clean. In fact, the Gemara, Uveisha Laksiv Merkav, does it never use a lashon of Merkav, writing, which is what you determined earlier is not appropriate for women? It never says that. So when Rivka went to meet Yitzchak, she rode. Rechiva means with her legs split apart. She went on this camels. How could you say that? So when you're traveling on a camel, which I believe is very very high, it's very high, and she's afraid that she's going to fall off the camel. There it's urcha de isha lirkov kadeshet machsekas boy biyadai viraglayim. When she's riding a camel, which is much more scary and much higher, there she's allowed to do rechiva, even though normally she shouldn't, because she wants to be able to hug it tighter, so she should not fall off. In fact, the more vaksiv vayikach Moshe as ishtoi vespana vayakiv malachamor. So there it's a chamor, it's not a gamal. So how could Moshe take his wife and ride her on the chamor and have her ride on the chamor? So tomorrow, hasam mishum Bonov. There, the way Rashi learns, it was her children that it uses the lashon rechiva for, and therefore it's only her children, the boys, rode with rechiva with a leg on either side, but not necessarily her. Although there are pshatim that said that once they sat that way, she was able to sit that way as well. In fact, the Gemara Baksiv, the Hira Cheves Alachamar, and this was talking about Abigail when she was coming to plead for her husband's life, who was married to Malchus against David HaMelech. So the Gemara Hasam, the reason why she was riding that way was Mishum Biasusa Delel. She was riding in the middle of the night. It's scary, so she rode that way. Urchu. Iboisema Mishum. I'm sorry. Mishum Biasusa Delelya Leka. It's not the fear of night that made her want to ride that way. Rather, it was Mishum Biasusa de David. She was terrified of her upcoming appointment with David HaMelech, and she was very nervous. She wanted to sit on her chamor more securely. It wasn't the fear of David HaMelech that made her ride that way. Rather, she was riding this donkey on a mountain, which makes it particularly scary, and that's why she did rechiva. Ika, period. Frek the Gemara, Dovi's kasha. Ubayraisa, me like Siftame. Are you claiming that you never find anywhere in the Torah the word Tame? You find the word Tame many times. Whenever there's not a big difference between expressing it in a very accurate, clean way versus not such an accurate way, Mishtoi b'lashon nekiya, it's going to use lashon nekiya. But kol heichad in efficient mili, but normally in the Torah, if the Torah is going to have to write extra letters, then mishtoi b'lashon ktsar. Then the Torah is not going to use the lashon that's tar. The Torah is rather going to pick a shorter lashon. So all over the Torah, the Torah prefers to use the lashon ktsar. Once or twice in the Torah deviated from its normal fashion to teach you another lesson, that a person should always be careful the way they speak. You should also be very concise and clear when you speak to your Talmud, when you teach your Talmud. So we have different lessons that the Torah is trying to teach us. So most of the time, the Torah always wants to use the derech tzara, because I guess that's the most important thing, is not to have too long a shir, not to have too long a drosha. But once the Torah deviated from its normal path and used a yiter lashon to illustrate another point, that a person should always be careful to speak b'lashon nekiya. Effectively, more. Are you telling me that whenever it's the same length of the word, the same amount of letters, the Torah would rather pick a lashon that's more coveted? The harecheves v'yesheves the chiadadininu. The ka'amar recheves. We had a number aleph that it uses the word recheves, even though it could have just as easily used the word yesheves. And according to your rule, that whenever it doesn't take any extra letters to express it, b'derech nekiya, that's the route that the Torah takes. Why by recheves did the Torah not say yesheves? And for the Gemara, recheves ksiv, it says it chaser without the vav. So you might ask, so it could have written yesheves without the vav. So to answer that, Rashi and Toshes both answer the kasha. The Alpha Gazak Rashi, the Matil Lemith of Nama Yesheves chaser, it could have said yesheves also without the vav. Miu kol chaser shebetayr lidrashay boy. When the Torah skips out a vav, it doesn't just do it; it does it to teach us an important lesson. So by using the word recheves without the vav, the kan lamdacha bechisaron zeh shetitbois loshen ktsara vafilu hu maguna. Shurikan tafas loshen maguna v'katzer. If it used recheves without the vav, then you could say that it did it to illustrate, to use the most concise loshen possible. But if it's in yesheves without a vav, there would be nothing for us to learn from the fact that it didn't use the vav, and therefore the Torah would rather yesheves without the vav, because Agavorcha also is teaching us that you should focus on speaking in a concise fashion. So basically, the Torah did, normally the general rule of the Torah is it sticks to the shortest lashon, even if it has to use the word tummy. But once the Torah was Meirich in its Lashon to illustrate that you have to be careful to be Lashon Nakiya. On the flip side, the Torah used not just a Lashon Nakiya, used Recheves without the Vav to hammer home and to highlight that you also have to focus on Derech Ketzar as well. So they're two very important things, and they have to both be accommodated. Story time. Hanu Tre Talmidim. There were two Talmidim that have a Yosy Kamei de Rav, and they were sitting in front of Rav, and they were knocked out. They had a shver shir that day, and they were just wiped from the difficulty of the sugya. Chad Omar, one of the Talmidim, to express their exhaustion, said, "Shvesina Hashmaitza, this sugya made me into kedov achim esakim. It made me into a wiped out pig. I feel like a wiped out ham." So that wasn't such a nice way of expressing it. The Chad Omar, but the other Talmud said, "Shvesina Hashmaitza kigdim esakim. I feel like a wiped out goat, which is a behemoth Torah." And Rav was not impressed with the Talmud that used the pig to compare himself to, and because of that, Rav didn't talk to this Talmud. I'm not sure how long he didn't talk to him for, but at that point, at least, Rav didn't talk to him to teach him a lesson that he needs to be careful with the way he speaks.
Dover Acher is already in Lashon Nakiya. He did.
He didn't say the word chaser.
That's right.
But I guess since he had the option of comparing himself to a different type of animal, Rav objected. That's a good point. Even when you're using a good word, you have to use a better word. Okay, very good. Zog to go right. How many trade Talmidi that have Yosvan Kamei the hill? There are two Talmidim that were sitting in front of hill. The Chad Minayu, and one of these two Talmidim happened to have been none other than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. V'amila Kamei the Rebbe, or maybe this story happened with two Talmidim sitting in front of Rebbe. The Chad Minayu Rabbi Yochanan, and one of them was Rabbi Yochanan. Notice how the Gemara conveniently omits the name of the other guy. Chad Omar, one of the two said, now the halacha is that once something is hochshel kabotoma, comes in contact with a liquid, then it could become tummy. But that's only if you want that liquid. So when people are harvesting grapes and they have grapes in the basket, and some liquid, some wine oozes out of the grapes, that's liquid that we want. And therefore, the grapes in the basket are going to be hochshel kabotoma. And therefore, if you take them to the press and they're hochshel kabotoma, you better be careful that there's no tumah involved. Because if there is, it's going to make your grapes tummy. Olives, on the other hand, the juice that oozes out of them are not something that people want. And therefore, they will not be machshir, the olives, to be makabel tumah. Which means when you squeeze olives, when you take them to the press to squeeze, you don't have to be careful for them to avoid tumah, because anyway they won't pick up tumah, because they're not hochshel makabel tumah. They never came in contact with a liquid that the Bailam wanted them to come in contact. So
yes, what's the difference between olive oil and like wine that comes from a grape?
Well, we're talking about not the oil. We're talking about the juice that comes out of the olive before you press it.
Okay.
Because the oil you for sure do want.
It's not oil. Okay.
Rashi calls it moihel. Let's see where Rashi says it. He says the word moihel. Moihel, the lechoshev, moihel hayoytze mehen lahachshir she'enei shemen gomer, the juice that oozes out of the olive naturally, even before you press it, is not real oil. Rather, the real oil is only hayoytze al yidei habat. Once you actually press it. So Zakta Helig Gemara. So they wanted to know. I already explained the difference between why you have to be careful with the tahira of grapes rather than not being careful with the tahira of olives. But they wanted to know why. So the way Rabbi Yochanan asked the kasha was, so he used the word tahira in both cases. The Chadam or the other Talmud asked, he didn't use nivel peh, not even by a stretch, but he didn't express his shaila in the most appropriate way. And he was not scolded for that at all. But Rabbi Yochanan, or Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, was admired for his attention to watch the way he spoke. And therefore his Rebbe said, Muftach ani bazeh, I'm sure about either Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai or Rabbi Yochanan, Shemoira hayra b'Yisrael, that he will eventually be a Posek Adar. But it didn't take very long, at hayra b'Yisrael. So you see somebody who's very makbid on the way they speak is in line. He's in line to be a Moyer Hayra. And that, it makes perfect sense, because someone who's a Moyer Hayra has to be so careful with every word that comes out of his mouth, because even if he speaks perfectly, he's going to be misquoted anyway 100 times. But at least he'll be able to argue that he was misquoted or taken out of context. But generally, they have to be very, very, very accurate. So if they ask a Rabbi Shaila, the safest answer is, it depends. Zok tehele gemara weiter. Hani tlosa kahani. There were 3 kahanim that were discussing how well they did in today's distribution of the lechem aponim. So it was probably Shabbos afternoon. They had their lechem aponim, and they were discussing their lechem aponim. Now we know they didn't get a lot of lechem aponim. Chad amalu, one said, Higiyani lapol. I got a very small amount, the size of a bean. The Chad Amar, Higiyani kezayis. I got a shirva kezayis. The Chad Amar, Higiyani kezanav halta. I got a piece that would be big if you chopped off the end of the tail of a certain sheretz tameh. That's how big the piece of bread that I got was. So first of all, you have to ask, this is not a shear. So you see from here that the mitzvah achilas lechem aponim, there's no chiyuv to eat a shear. You only have to taste it a little bit, meaning the main focus is that it should be eaten up, but not that anybody has a specific mitzvah achila. Although there are those who learn that at least one kohen has to eat a shear of it, and then everybody else gets the shrine. It's like by the Rebbe. The Rebbe eats, and then everyone else gets the shrine. Although often people eat more shrine than the Rebbe eats. So Zok the Gemara. So one of the Kohanim expressed the amount of lechem aponim that he got in a less than ideal fashion. But to achara, they looked into him to see where they kohen. They in fact found out that Rashi says he was a cholol. They found out that he was posel kahuna. Maybe his mother was a grusha. Frek the Gemara. But Tanya, we learned that ein boitkin mina mizbeach ulamayla. And I believe this is a 2-pronged kasha. A is, once a person, when the kohen came in to do the avodah, they went into the lishkas hagozis, and the bezdin analyzed each of them to make sure that they're kosher, their yichus is kosher, and then paskin on them that they could do the avodah. Once someone does the avodah, you never have to check anymore, and you can assume that it's always kosher. And this is also used to be mater his daughter to marry a kohen, and we know that his daughter will be a kohen, a kohenes, a proper bas kohen. So the kasha is 2 prongs. A is, you're not supposed to be boidik min mizbech l'mayla. So why would they launch an investigation? Once he got a clearance, once he got a security clearance from the Lishkas Hagozis, how do they now look into him again? A and B is, how is it possible that they actually found a problem? Did the Bezdin not do a good job in their screening originally? They didn't find a psul yichus in him, because in fact he was cleared, and they wouldn't even look for that, because what does that mean? Rashi says, "Hu atmoy hoyagasruach." They found out that he was an arrogant person, umavaze kosher shemayim, and he would speak without respect about kosher shemayim. The ein roy l'shamish. His personality, his behavior, disqualified him from serving in the Beis Hamikdash. The kaimalon avoida masur l'bnei Aaron, the avoida that was given over to the bnei Aaron, kohen she'ein moed b'chulan, a kohen who's not in compliance and in agreement with every single avodah, even some avodas that might be uncomfortable. But if the kohen's not eager to do all of them, ein lo chelek b'kuhuna. So this fellow was determined to be someone who is ein lo chelek b'kuhuna. And what triggered the investigation? Because he spoke without the proper respect about the lechem upon him. Zok Gemara Vater, v'boy zema shiny hasam the iud ara nafshe. Normally, you don't look into a kohen once he's approved, once he passed the security clearance of the Lishkas Agosos. But since he did something that was very out of character for a kohen, they were allowed to look into him again. As Rashi says, the ara nafshi, the hitzrich bedika acharav. Since he acted inappropriately, that necessitated the need to look into it more carefully. The Gilan, we actually uncovered, in fact, yes, Bezdin made a mistake. It's possible that the ballots weren't properly screened, and therefore he had to be rejected. Sorry, Shlomo, I couldn't help that.
Yes. 1 second, maybe I missed this. What is so terrible with the word Lila versus R? That we have all these examples. It seems pretty clear, but what I don't get the.
So Rashi told us that in this case, it's not a question of not a nice lashon. It's not a question of maguna. It's a question of accuracy, and that's why I brought in the Rivitz, who says or means the beginning of the night. So from Rashi says from what Reb Shimon Levi brought up that a person has to be careful to speak in a clean fashion. We also learn that a person has to be very careful about the words that he uses, and therefore you have to pick words that are of the highest accuracy. So it's not exactly apples to apples. But Rashi asks your kasha.
It's not even close.
That's
Like
right.
This whole Amud of Gemara is close to irrelevant.
Yeah. So let's look at Rashi just to maybe I understood Rashi wrong. We'll look at the Rashi together. Rashi says over here. My time with Latani Lele, Kiditani Neve Shmuel, Umashani Alishna Ma'alya Kamahader. We're looking for a nice lashon. So mitzvah v'derech nekiya hadas l'saper b'lashon nekiya. So the question is, where do you see that it's not lucky? So
Maybe
Rashi,
Kamahalia he means a better lashon.
the best type of lashon. But the examples are maguna. So Rashi is right over here. Lav mishum the leili davar maguna. Using the word leili is not a davar maguna. So we're bringing Rabbi Shimon Levi as an example how a person has to has to be clear and clean. Maybe it's also drawing from the fact that it's a balance between naki and accurate. In short, the main thing is there's a focus on picking the right words.
Yeah. Okay, sure.
But the horror is a good one. So let's see. Now's a Geshmaka story. This is a good story. It's a famous story. It's a Geshmaka story. Zok the Gemara as follows. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. I'm sorry, it's a little bit before here. Tahu Aramah. So now we're going to illustrate how normally you don't investigate, but when you see something strange, when you see election results that simply don't add up, you see anomalies jumping out at you. Yeah, it mandates that we look into it a little bit more closely, just like this kohen who spoke improperly. So there was this guy. He used to get invited out to people for Pesach, and he got them to include him in their group for the Korban Pesach. And he was making fun of Rabbi Yehuda. Amar, he said, your Torah says a guy is not allowed to eat Korban Pesach. I get the nicest rib steak every year from the Korban Pesach with all the Jews. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, he didn't live in Yerushalayim. He lived in Tavyon. I think it's where he lived. And there, Jews weren't in control. So he had no way of stopping this guy or even punishing him, because Klal Yisrael weren't in charge there. But in Yerushalayim, the Jews were in charge. So Rabbi Yehuda was hopeless to make any changes, and it's not like he can WhatsApp his friends in Yerushalayim to warn them. There was no communication, so he had to use the Goy himself to communicate somehow to the Jews of Yerushalayim that this guy shouldn't be eating from the Korban Pesach. So Amalei Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, he says, Shkoyach, the Jews, they figured you out already. They didn't give you a good part of the meat, they gave you the garbage. Mika Safalim Alya, did they ever give you from the tail? Now the tail of the kevesh, of the sheep, is a part that you're makav on the mizbeach. But the guy didn't know that. So Rabbi Yehuda says, "Shkoich, they're giving you the garbage. They're fooling you. They never gave you from the tail. Amar lei, loy. No, they never gave me from the tail." So Rabbi Yehuda ben Besair told him, "My bezoiki solkas lahosam. You really want to show me that you can fool us all? When you get up there, Emalahu, ask your host, Shafi Mizalia. Don't say I don't want this ripstick. I want the tail." Hoki Salak, when the guy went up, Amar Lahu, he said, "Me'alia Safali, give me from the tail." Amar lei, really? Alia legavoya salka. They said to themselves, the tail, your makar, why would he want that? Amar, they asked him, Man Amar Lachaki, who gave you this idea to ask us for the tail? Amar Lahu, he said, Rabbi Yehuda ben Besair Amru, I'm no fool. Ich ken the halachas. Na mich nicht up. Ich habe geredet mit der Ruf dort. Der Ruf hat mich gesagt, als ich darf beten, das beste Stickel, not this garbage that you're giving me. So Amru, my hide to come on. What's going on here? Something strange is going on. They checked him out in the mikveh. Vashkechu darmohu. They found out, in fact, that he was a goy, and because of that, the katlu, they killed him. So the trial is why there's a whole bunch of trials here. A is why did they kill him, but B is why didn't Rabbi Yehuda didn't kill him? Rabbi Yehuda was over there, but why didn't Rabbi Yehuda come himself to be oil regel to Yerushalayim, and he could have told him himself? So Tosfos speaks out that he didn't go up either because he was very old, he couldn't do it anymore, or he didn't own land in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore he wasn't mechuyev to go be oil regel. Anyway, Sholchol the Rabbi Yehuda ben Besair, they sent back a note to Rabbi Yehuda ben Besair. Shalom lach Rabbi Yehuda ben Besair, da'at ben Netziven, not Tzivion. You live in Netziven, but you still have control in Yerushalayim. The reason why
Yosy,
yes.
so about that tail. So
Tail with the T-A-L-E or T-A-I-L?
T-A-I-L. So every tail from every Korban Pesach went on the Mizbeach?
Only if it's a keves. Not all animals you makar the tail on the Mizbeach, but a keves you do.
So, 1 second. So was shechted in the base of Migdash, so they
Right.
cut off the tail of the keves. They must have also taken the...
Imurim. Yeah.
They
makar
took
all the
the-
Imurim.
I took all the worm. Oh,
Yeah.
oh, wow. So how does all that fit on a Mizbeach from all of Klal Yisrael, all of these...
We had
Thank-
Gemaras about that. And we had Gemaras about how that's why Shlomo Melech had to make the Mizbeach much bigger. There's discussion about that. Shlomo Melech ended up expanding the Mizbeach because it was just too vast.
Okay, so before Shlomo Melech.
I'm not
still,
sure.
they're
I
still moving.
remember the Gemara discussed it, how that would be possible.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see the next story. Rav Kahana Chalosh, Rav Kahana was sick. Shadjur Rabban Rabbi Yeshua ber Davidi. They sent it to Rabbi Yeshua ber Davidi. Amrullah, they told him, Zil B'doik Ma'adine. Go see what's happening with Rav Kahana. He's not well. Also, he came. Ashkechei Denach Nafshe. He saw that Rav Kahana had passed away. He raised Kriya, but he didn't want to be a bearer of bad news. So he hid his Kriya. When he came back, they shouldn't see. And he hid it so people couldn't see. But Uvachi Vasi, he was crying because he was very sad. Rav Kahana was nifter. Amrullah, they asked him, Nach Nafshe, did Rav Kahana die? Amrullah, he said, Ana loy kamina. I don't want to tell you. Umoitzi diba huksil. Someone who spreads bad news is a fool. I don't want to say. So he sort of hinted to them without coming out right and saying it. Yoichlin Chakuka, Navik L'Kriyasa, he went out to the villages to check on how his crops were growing. Ki also, when he came, Amrullah, they told him, Chitin Nasu Yafos. He told them, I'm sorry, when he came back from checking, he realized that the Chitin were not good at all. So they asked him, Chitin Nasu Yafos? So instead of answering them no, he didn't want to be a bearer of bad news, Amrullah, Sa'arim Nasu Yafos. The barley came out good. In other words, to hint that the Chitin didn't turn out so well. Amrullah, say we have no interest in barley. Barley are served to horses and to donkeys. So why are you telling us about barley? I have a little member. He didn't want to say outright that the chitin were bad. So he said, sorry, why were they upset the way he spoke? So have a little, he could have said, remember, he could have said, last year the chitin came out good. Or inami adoshim nasiyafos, beans came out good, which are also Michael Adam, and it would have conveyed the same point that the chitin didn't come out good without him having to say it explicitly. Okay, I guess we better stop here.
Yossi, it reminds me of the lady that's looking in the mirror. Hello?
Right.
Shkoyach.
Go ahead.
Yossi?
Yeah, guys looking in the mirror.
No, the wife is looking in the mirror and tells her husband, "Oh, I got this flab and that flab and this wrinkle and that wrinkle. Is there anything good about me?"